Today we're going to be taking notes over Learning Target 2.4, finding x and y intercepts from graphs and tables. Please open your notebook and title the left side with 2.4 practice in your name, and on the right side 2.4 notes, level 7, and please copy down the learning target above. Under the learning target, please copy down these notes over x and y intercepts. On the bottom half of your paper, please copy this down. We won't have you guys copy down the graphs or tables, so this is what you'll use to follow along. In order to find our x-intercept on this table, we need to find the point where our y value is at 0. So if we take a look in our y value column, we'll notice that our y value is at 0 right here. So the way we would write that is 28, 0. In order to find my y-intercept, it's going to be the exact opposite. So my y-intercept is when my x value is 0. So if I take a look at my x value column, I'm going to find that I have an x value of 0 right here. So my point is 0, 28. On this table over here, we're going to notice something a little bit different. When it asks for our x-intercepts, we know that we want to find the place where my y value is at 0. So if I take a look at my y value column, I'm going to notice that I have a 0 right here. So right here is one of my x-intercepts. But if I look all the way down, I'm also going to notice that I have a 0 right here. It is okay for functions to have two x-intercepts sometimes. So for this question, I'm going to write -3, 0, the point right here, and then my other point, which is at 1, 0. For my y-intercept, I'm going to find the place where my x value is at 0. So if I take a look at my x value column, I'm going to notice that right here, I have a point at 0, -3. For our next two tables, we're still going to be finding x and y intercepts, but we're going to add a different component to it this time. So if we take a look at our first table, we're going to try to find our x-intercepts. So remember, our x-intercept is when my y value is at 0. So if I take a look in my y value column, I'm going to notice that I have a y value of 0 right here. So my point is -2, 0. Remember, I always write these as coordinate points. Now to find my y-intercept, this is going to be a little bit different. My y-intercept is where my x value is going to be at 0. So if I take a look in my x value column, I'm going to go down and realize that I don't have a point where my x value is at 0. But that's not to say that there isn't one. So if I were to take a look at what's going on here, I would notice that -4, -3, -2, -1, what's happening every single time is we're just adding 1 in this column. So if I add 1 to -1, I'm going to end up with 0. I would have to do the same thing in my y value column in order to get my whole point. So if I see what's going on here, 2, 1, 0, -1, I can tell that I'm going down 1, so subtracting 1 every single time. So -1 minus 1 is -2. So here I have my y-intercept, 0, -2. The last thing I want to do, and we didn't do these with the last two tables, is I want to figure out what type of function this is. So if I take a look at the patterns that are happening on each side of my table, I notice that I'm adding 1 over here to my x values and subtracting 1 over here to my y values. This is a constant rate of change, which means that this function is linear. The first thing I want to find is my x-intercepts. If you remember back to what we did over here, my x-intercept is when my y value is 0. So if I take a look in my y value column, I'm going to notice that I don't have a y value of 0 in this column. So if I want to figure out whether or not I have an x-intercept, I could keep drawing boxes down here. And I would figure out that if I'm going from 2 to 1 to 0.5 to 0.25, what's happening every time here is I'm dividing by 2. If I were to divide 0.25 by 2, I would get a decimal. If I would divide that decimal by 2, I would get an even smaller decimal. And what you guys will figure out is that if I just continue dividing a number by 2, I'm going to get really, really close to 0, but I'm never going to reach 0. So what we can figure out based on this table is that there aren't actually any x-intercepts for this function. So I can write none where it says x-intercepts. For my y-intercepts, remember my y-intercept is when my x value is 0. So I can take a look at my x value column, notice that I have a 0 here and a 2 here. So my y-intercept is at 0, 2. Because in this function, I'm dividing by 2, we're going to realize that this function is an exponential function.
We've finished our notes over finding x and y intercepts from tables, so this is what your notebook should look like. Please flip to the next page in your notebook and on the right side copy down these notes over finding x and y intercepts for graphs. Like we said, you won't be copying down the graphs themselves, so this is what you'll use to follow along to the videos.
So if I look at this first graph here and I want to find the x-intercept, I want to find the spot where it crosses the x-axis. Again, this is the x-axis. I notice that it crosses at this point right here. If this says 5, this is 6. So I know my graph crosses at 6, 0. For my y-intercept, I want where it crosses the y-axis. I notice that it crosses right here. So my y-intercept is at 0, -6. For the function type, I notice that this is a straight line, which means it has a constant rate of change, so my function is linear. Over here, I also have a linear function, so I'll fill that in first. For my x-intercept, I want the spot where it crosses my x-axis. I'll notice here that it doesn't quite cross at 1, which is okay, so you guys can just make up a point that's almost at 1. So I'm going to write 0.8, 0. Again, on my y-intercept, I want the spot where it crosses my y-axis. So if I look at my y-axis, I'll notice that it crosses at 1. So my y-intercept is at 0, 1. So if we want to find our x-intercept of this graph right here, we want to find the spot where this graph crosses the x-axis. So if I pay attention, this is my x-axis here, this is my y-axis. This graph, if you see it go up this way, is going to cross my x-axis right here. So if I put a point right here, I notice that this is the number 2. And so my x value is 2, and my y value, since I don't go up or down and I hit it on that x-axis, is going to be 0. So my x-intercept is at 2, 0. For my y-intercept, I'm going to be finding the spot where my graph crosses the y-axis. So if I look at my graph here, I'm going to notice that it crosses my y-axis at, this is in between -2 and -4, so that's -3. And remember, my x value is 0. So I know that my y-intercept is going to be at 0, -3. Finally, it asks us what type of function this is. If I take a look at it, it's in a slope like this, so I know that this is an exponential function. If I go over here, this is also an exponential function. It's just going the other way. So I'm going to label that. And now it wants us to find the x-intercepts and the y-intercepts, right? So in order to find the x-intercepts, I have to find the spot where this crosses my x-axis. So if I take a look at this graph, we're going to notice that the graph gets really close to hitting the x-axis, but like we talked about in the table before, we're going to notice that this graph is going to get really, really, really close to 0, but it's never actually going to hit it. It's going to line up against the x-axis, but it's never going to go through it. So for my x-intercepts, I can write none. Finally, for my y-intercepts, I'm going to find the spot where my graph crosses the y-axis. So I will notice that it crosses right here, And if I'm going by ones, this point is at 0, 1. We want to find the x-intercept of this graph now. So in order to find the x-intercepts, if you guys remember, it's okay for there to be two x-intercepts sometimes. So if I look at the spot where this graph crosses the x-axis here, I'm going to notice that it crosses at 2 points. That's at -5. This point is at 1. So my two x-intercepts, remember 2 is fine, are at -5, 0, and 1, 0. For my y-intercept, I want the spot where my graph crosses my y-axis. So if I pay attention to my graph, I'll notice that it crosses my y-axis right here. That point's -5. So again, with my y-intercept, my x value is going to be 0. So 0, -5 is my y-intercept. Finally, if you guys remember for function type, this graph looks like a U shape, so that is a quadratic function. This graph is also U-shaped, so again, it's a quadratic as well. And for my x-intercepts, on this graph, I'm going to look for the place where my graph crosses my x-axis. If I look here, my graph never crosses my x-axis. So I know that for this graph, there are no x-intercepts. For my y-intercept, I want the spot where it crosses my y-axis. So if this is my y-axis, I'm going to notice that it crosses right here, which is in between the points 4 and 6. So I notice that it crosses at 5. Again, my x value is 0, my y value is 5. So these are the last two graphs that we're going to look at. We want to find our x and y intercepts. For my x-intercepts on this graph, we're going to look at where it crosses the x-axis. We'll notice that this is -3, so we know it crosses at -1 and -2. So my x-intercepts are -1, 0, and -2, 0. My y-intercepts, we want to look and see where it crosses my y-axis. So this down here is -3, so I know that it crosses at 0, -3. Finally, this function you guys know because it's a V shape that it's an absolute value function. Over here we have our second graph. We know that it's an absolute value function because it's just like the last one. And finally, we want to find our x and y intercepts. So my x-intercepts, it crosses at the origin, which is 0, 0. And it also crosses at 4, 0. For my y-intercept, we're going to notice that it actually has the same y-intercept that it does my x-intercept, and that's because it crosses the origin. So it crosses over both at the same time.
We have now finished our notes over 2.4, so this is what your notebook should look like. Once you have finished, please go back to today's date in Canvas, and you all will have a practice worksheet over finding x and y intercepts from tables and graphs.